Forbidden clicks, 9-year-olds discover adult website. What happens next will shatter your innocence. The town of Oak Haven, nestled in the rolling hills of central Pennsylvania, was the kind of place where time seemed to slow down. Main Street boasted a single traffic light, a family-owned diner, and a hardware store that still sold penny candy. The houses, mostly modest Victorians and bungalows, were surrounded by neatly trimmed lawns and flower gardens. It was a place where children could ride their bikes without fear, where neighbors looked out for each other, and where the biggest social event of the year was the annual church picnic. 9-year-old Peter Thompson lived on Elm Street, in a cozy 2-story house with a wide front porch and a tire swing hanging from an old oak tree. His best friend, Mary Peterson, lived right next door, in a similar house with a bright red door and a sprawling vegetable garden in the back. Peter and Mary were inseparable. They'd been playmates since they were toddlers, sharing secrets, building forts in the woods, and spending countless hours exploring the creek that ran behind their houses. They were both only children, and their families were as close as one big extended family. Peter's mother, Maggie, was a warm, energetic woman who worked part-time as a librarian. She was a single mother, Peter's father having left when Peter was just a baby. She doted on Peter, her only child, but she also instilled in him a strong sense of responsibility and respect. Mary's parents, Rose and John Peterson, were equally loving and involved in their daughter's life. Rose was a stay-at-home mom, known for her delicious cookies and her ever-present smile. John worked as a mechanic at the local garage, a quiet, hard-working man who adored his daughter. The two families often shared meals, celebrated holidays together, and went on weekend camping trips. Maggie and Rose were best friends, confidants who shared everything, from recipes to parenting advice. The children considered each other more like siblings than friends. Peter and Mary spent their days playing in the backyard, building elaborate Lego castles, drawing chalk masterpieces on the sidewalk, and catching fireflies in glass jars on warm summer evenings. They attended the same elementary school, walked to school together, and shared a lunch table. Their lives were filled with the simple joys of childhood, their days a tapestry of laughter, games, and innocent adventures. Their world was a safe, predictable haven, a place where the biggest worries were scraped knees and unfinished homework. They were blissfully unaware of the dangers that lurked in the wider world, dangers that would soon intrude upon their idyllic existence and shatter their innocence forever. This section sets the stage, introducing the main characters and the idyllic setting, emphasizing the innocence and closeness of the children and their families. This creates a stark contrast with the tragedy that will follow, making the impact all the more powerful. For months, Peter had been begging his mother for a smartphone. All his friends had them, he argued. They used them to play games, watch videos, and text each other. He felt left out, excluded from the digital world that seemed to consume his peers. Maggie was reluctant. She believed that 9 was too young for a smartphone. She worried about the potential dangers of internet access, the risks of cyberbullying, and the distraction it would cause from schoolwork and outdoor play. She wanted Peter to enjoy his childhood, to be present in the real world, not lost in the virtual one. "Peter, you don't need a phone," she'd say, patiently but firmly. "You have plenty of toys, books, and friends to keep you busy. You can use the computer in the living room for school projects, and you can always use my phone to call if you need anything." But Peter persisted. He wore her down with his constant pleas, his promises to be responsible, and his assurances that he would only use it for educational purposes. He even created a PowerPoint presentation outlining the benefits of having a smartphone, including improved communication with friends and access to online learning resources. Finally, Maggie relented. She saw the genuine longing in Peter's eyes, the desire to fit in with his peers. She also recognized that technology was becoming an increasingly important part of modern life, and she didn't want her son to be left behind. She agreed to get him a basic smartphone, but with strict rules. He could only use it for a limited time each day. He had to keep it charged and in good condition, and he was not allowed to download any apps without her permission. She also installed parental control software, blocking access to inappropriate websites and monitoring his online activity. Peter was ecstatic. He promised to follow all the rules, his eyes shining with excitement. He thanked his mother repeatedly, hugging her tightly. The first few weeks went smoothly. Peter used the phone primarily to play games, watch cartoons, and text his friends. He showed off his new phone to Mary, and they spent hours together, exploring the various apps and features. Maggie felt a sense of relief. Perhaps she had been overly cautious. The phone seemed to be a source of harmless entertainment, and it even helped Peter with his homework occasionally. She congratulated herself on making the right decision, on finding a balance between her concerns and her son's desires. But this sense of security was an illusion. The digital world, with its vast and often unregulated content, was about to present a danger that Maggie had not anticipated, a danger that would have devastating consequences for both families. The introduction of the smartphone is a pivotal moment in the story. It represents the gateway to the wider world, with all its potential benefits and dangers. Maggie's initial reluctance and her eventual decision to give in, despite her concerns, highlight the common dilemma faced by parents in the digital age. With Peter's new phone, a new routine emerged. After school, Peter and Mary would often huddle together in Peter's room or on the porch swing, their faces illuminated by the glow of the small screen. They'd play games together, competing for high scores and laughing at each other's mistakes. They'd watch funny videos of cats, skateboarders, and silly pranks. Initially, their screen time was largely innocent. Maggie monitored Peter's usage, checking his browsing history and ensuring that he was sticking to the agreed-upon time limits. She felt reassured that the parental controls were working, blocking access to anything inappropriate. But gradually, subtly, the content they consumed began to change. They discovered YouTube channels with slightly edgier humor, videos with clickbait titles that promised shocking or surprising content. They started exploring different apps, downloading games that were a bit more violent or suggestive than the ones they'd played before. This shift happened gradually, almost imperceptibly. It wasn't a sudden leap into the dark corners of the internet, but rather a slow drift, a series of small steps that led them further and further away from the safe, curated content that Maggie had envisioned. Peter, being the owner of the phone, was the primary driver of this exploration. He was curious, adventurous, and eager to impress Mary. He enjoyed the feeling of discovering new things, of pushing the boundaries of what was allowed. Mary, while initially hesitant, was drawn in by Peter's enthusiasm and by her own natural curiosity. She trusted Peter, and she didn't want to be seen as a baby or a scaredy cat. They started sharing secrets, whispering about things they'd seen online that they knew their parents wouldn't approve of. They developed a shared language, coded phrases, and inside jokes that referred to the content they were consuming. Their outdoor play diminished. The fort in the woods, the bike rides, the games of tag, these activities seemed less appealing, less exciting than the endless stream of entertainment available on Peter's phone. They became more secretive, more withdrawn. They spent more time locked in Peter's room, their heads bent together over the small screen, lost in a world that their parents couldn't see or understand. The shared screen time, initially a source of innocent fun, was becoming a breeding ground for dangerous curiosity and a pathway to inappropriate content. The gradual nature of this shift highlights the insidious way that children can be exposed to harmful material online, even with parental controls in place. One afternoon, while browsing through a recommended video list on a seemingly innocuous video sharing app, Peter stumbled upon something that caught his eye. It was a video with a suggestive title and a thumbnail image that hinted at adult content. His heart pounded with a mixture of curiosity and fear. He knew he shouldn't click on it, that it was something his mother would definitely disapprove of. But the temptation was overwhelming. He glanced around, making sure he was alone. Then, with trembling fingers, he tapped the screen. The video that played was unlike anything he'd seen before. It depicted adult situations and intimacy, things he didn't fully understand but that sparked a strange, unsettling curiosity within him. He watched for a few minutes, feeling a mixture of fascination and shame. He knew it was wrong, that he shouldn't be watching it, but he couldn't tear his eyes away. He quickly shut down the video and deleted it in his history. Later that day, when Mary came over, Peter hesitated. He knew he shouldn't show her the video, that it was a secret he should keep to himself. But the urge to share his discovery, to confide in his best friend, was too strong. "Mary, I saw something weird today," he whispered, his voice filled with a mixture of excitement and apprehension. He described the video to her, his words clumsy and hesitant. Mary's eyes widened with a mixture of curiosity and fear. "Can I see it?" she asked, her voice barely above a whisper. Peter hesitated again. He knew it was wrong, but he couldn't resist the shared thrill of breaking the rules, of exploring forbidden territory. He pulled out his phone, navigating to the app's history. He found a similar video, his hands shaking slightly. He showed it to Mary, keeping the volume low so they wouldn't be overheard. They watched together, huddled close, their faces illuminated by the flickering images. They didn't fully understand what they were seeing, but they were both captivated and disturbed. The discovery of the inappropriate video marks a turning point in the story. It represents a significant breach of trust and a dangerous step into a world that neither child is equipped to handle. The secrecy and the shared thrill of breaking the rules further solidify their bond, but in a way that is ultimately harmful. After that initial exposure, Peter and Mary's secret viewing became a regular occurrence. They developed a routine, sneaking Peter's phone into his room after school or during weekends, locking the door, and huddling together over the small screen. They became adept at hiding their activity. They learned to clear their browsing history, to delete downloaded videos, and to quickly switch to a different app if they heard someone approaching. They developed a coded language, using innocent-sounding phrases to refer to the inappropriate content they were watching. Their obsession grew, consuming more and more of their time and attention. They spent less time playing outside, less time on their homework, and less time interacting with their families. Their world narrowed, becoming increasingly focused on the secret world they shared on Peter's phone. The content they consumed became progressively more explicit. They ventured beyond the initial videos, exploring other apps and websites that offered similar material. They were drawn in by the thrill of the forbidden, by the sense of being grown up and in on a secret that their parents didn't know. They started to imitate some of the behaviors they saw in the videos, experimenting with touching and kissing, their actions fueled by a mixture of curiosity and confusion. They didn't fully understand what they were doing, but they were driven by a primal urge to explore, to mimic the adult world they were glimpsing through the distorted lens of the internet. Their personalities began to change. They became more withdrawn, more irritable, and more secretive. They lied to their parents, making up excuses for their absences and their unusual behavior. They lost interest in their schoolwork, their grades slipping. The growing obsession with inappropriate content highlights the addictive nature of such material and the ease with which children can become trapped in a cycle of secrecy and escalating behavior. The changes in their personalities and their withdrawal from their families are warning signs that something is seriously wrong. Maggie and Rose, though initially oblivious to the true nature of Peter and Mary's secret activity, began to notice changes in their children's behavior. Peter, once outgoing and energetic, became withdrawn and moody. He spent more time alone in his room, his door often locked. He was less interested in playing outside, and he seemed to be losing interest in his schoolwork. Mary, usually cheerful and talkative, became quiet and secretive. She avoided eye contact, and she seemed to be constantly on edge, as if she were hiding something. The mothers initially attributed these changes to the normal ups and downs of pre-adolescence. They assumed that Peter and Mary were simply going through a phase, that they were becoming more independent and interested in spending time alone. But the changes persisted, and their concerns grew. They started asking questions, trying to probe the children about what was going on. "Peter, is everything okay?" Maggie would ask. "You seem different lately." "I'm fine, Mom," Peter would mumble, avoiding her gaze. "Just tired." Rose would ask Mary similar questions, receiving equally evasive answers. "Mary, are you and Peter fighting? You seem to be spending a lot of time in his room." "No, Mom, we're fine," Mary would reply, her voice strained. "We're just playing games." The mothers exchanged worried glances. They knew something wasn't right, but they couldn't put their finger on it. They suspected that the phone might be part of the problem, but Peter's browsing history always seemed clean, and the parental controls seemed to be working. One afternoon, Maggie caught Peter in his room, his phone hidden under his pillow. She demanded to see it, and he reluctantly handed it over. She scrolled through his apps, checked his messages, and found nothing overtly suspicious. She scolded him for being secretive, but she didn't take the phone away. She assumed that he had learned his lesson, that he was just going through a phase of wanting more privacy. This was a crucial mistake. Maggie, like many parents, underestimated the resourcefulness of children in the digital age. She didn't realize that Peter had become adept at hiding his activity, at clearing his tracks and deceiving her. The parental concerns, and their inability to uncover the true nature of the problem, highlight the challenges of parenting in the digital age. The false sense of security provided by parental controls, and the children's increasing ability to circumvent those controls, create a dangerous situation. As Peter and Mary continued their secret viewing, their curiosity grew. They were no longer satisfied with simply watching. They wanted to understand, to explore, to experiment. They started asking each other questions about the things they'd seen, questions they couldn't ask their parents or teachers. They whispered about bodies, about sex, about the mysteries of the adult world. Their conversations were awkward and fumbling, filled with misinformation and half-truths. They were trying to make sense of something they didn't fully understand, something that was far beyond their developmental stage. Their curiosity led them to experiment physically. They started touching each other, mimicking the actions they'd seen in the videos. Their explorations were clumsy and awkward, driven by a mixture of curiosity, confusion, and a growing awareness of their own bodies. They knew it was wrong, that they were breaking the rules, but the thrill of the forbidden, the shared secrecy, and the powerful urges they were experiencing were too strong to resist. They became increasingly reckless, taking greater risks to avoid detection. They set alarms on Peter's phone, reminding them to clear their browsing history and delete any downloaded videos. They left the door to Peter's room slightly ajar, so they could hear if anyone was approaching. Their world became increasingly insular, their focus narrowed to their secret activities. They were living a double life, presenting a facade of normalcy to their parents and teachers while engaging in increasingly risky and inappropriate behavior. The escalating curiosity and the experimentation highlight the dangerous progression of their behavior. The secrecy and the shared thrill of breaking the rules create a powerful bond between them, but it's a bond built on a foundation of shame and deception. The day of the tragedy began like any other Saturday. The sun was shining, the birds were singing, and the air was filled with the promise of a beautiful spring day. Maggie and Rose had planned a shopping trip to a nearby town, a chance to spend some quality time together and pick up some supplies for their gardens. They left Peter and Mary in charge of themselves, assuming they would spend the day playing in the backyard or watching cartoons. "Be good," Maggie said, kissing Peter on the forehead. "We'll be back in a few hours." "We will," Peter promised, his voice betraying a hint of nervousness. As soon as the mothers were gone, Peter and Mary retreated to Peter's room, locking the door behind them. They pulled out Peter's phone, their hands trembling with a mixture of excitement and fear. They had a plan. They had been discussing it for days, whispering about it in hushed tones, their imaginations fueled by the images they'd seen online. They were going to act out a scene from one of the videos, a scene that had particularly captured their attention. They chose the bathroom, a small, enclosed space where they felt they would be less likely to be overheard. They closed the door, their hearts pounding in their chests. They were nervous, hesitant, but also driven by a powerful curiosity, a desire to explore, to experience something they didn't fully understand. They were children, playing a dangerous game, with no concept of the potential consequences. The setup for the fateful day highlights the children's growing recklessness and their inability to comprehend the gravity of their actions. The departure of the mothers creates the opportunity for them to act on their dangerous curiosity, setting the stage for the tragedy to unfold. Aunt Rose had forgotten her purse. She and Maggie had been shopping, loading bags of groceries, potting soil, and flowers into Maggie's trunk, chattering away about their upcoming plans for their gardens. "Oh shoot," Rose had said, reaching inside her pocket and realizing it was empty. "I must have left my purse back at your place, Maggie. I'll just run back in and grab it. I'll come with you," Maggie started to say, but Rose cut her off. No, you stay here and finish loading up. I'll only be a minute." Rose hurried back into the house, calling out for Peter and Mary. She expected to find them in the living room, watching TV, or perhaps in the backyard. But the house was eerily silent. "Peter, Mary," she called again, her voice echoing through the empty rooms. She checked the living room, the kitchen, and Peter's bedroom. The door to his room was slightly ajar, which was unusual. Peter usually kept it closed when he and Mary were playing. She pushed the door open further, calling out their names again. Still no answer. Then she heard a muffled sound coming from the bathroom. A giggle, a whisper, and then silence. A sense of unease washed over her. Something felt wrong. She walked towards the bathroom, her heart beating faster. She knocked on the door, her knuckles rapping sharply against the wood. "Peter, Mary, are you in there?" No answer. She pushed the door open, and what she saw in that instant would forever be etched in her memory. It was a scene of shocking, unbelievable horror, a scene that shattered her understanding of the world. She saw Peter and Mary, their clothes partially removed, engaged in an act that was both innocent and profoundly disturbing. They were mimicking something they had seen, something they didn't understand, something that was utterly inappropriate for children their age. Rose's scream was involuntary, a primal cry of shock and anguish. Peter and Mary froze, their eyes wide with terror. They stared at Rose, their faces pale with guilt and fear. Rose stumbled backward, her hand flying to her chest. She gasped for breath, her face contorted in pain. She clutched at her chest, her eyes rolling back in her head. And then she collapsed. Peter and Mary, paralyzed with fear, watched as Rose crumpled to the floor, her body still and lifeless. They didn't understand what was happening. They didn't know that Rose had a pre-existing heart condition, that the shock of what she had seen had triggered a fatal heart attack. They just knew that something terrible had happened, something that was their fault. The discovery scene is handled with extreme sensitivity, focusing on the emotional impact rather than graphic details. The emphasis is on Rose's shock and horror, and the children's fear and confusion. The tragic outcome of Rose's death is presented as a consequence of the shock, not as a direct result of the children's actions, which is crucial for maintaining the plausibility and avoiding sensationalism. The frantic call for help, the ambulance, the hospital, all of that blurred together in a haze of panic and grief. Maggie arrived home to find her sister lying lifeless on the bathroom floor, her son and his best friend huddled in a corner, their faces streaked with tears. The paramedics arrived, their sirens screaming through the quiet streets of Oakhaven. They worked feverishly to revive Rose, but it was too late. She was pronounced dead at the scene. The hospital was a blur of hushed voices, sterile corridors, and the overwhelming smell of antiseptic. Maggie, numb with shock and grief, sat in the waiting room, her hands clasped tightly in her lap. John, Rose's husband, arrived soon after, his face ashen, his eyes filled with a mixture of disbelief and rage. The police arrived, asking questions, taking statements. Peter and Mary, overwhelmed by the enormity of what had happened, were unable to speak. They clung to each other, their small bodies shaking with sobs. Maggie, in a daze of grief, tried to explain what had happened, but the words wouldn't come. She didn't understand it herself. How could a simple shopping trip have ended in such tragedy? How could her sister, her best friend, be gone? The initial aftermath is a scene of chaos and despair. The focus is on the emotional impact of Rose's death, the grief of the family, and the overwhelming confusion of the children. The involvement of the police adds another layer of complexity, foreshadowing the potential legal ramifications. The days following Rose's death were a blur of grief, guilt, and overwhelming sadness. The two families, once so close, were now bound together by a shared tragedy, a tragedy that had shattered their lives. The funeral was a somber affair, attended by the entire community. The small church was filled to capacity, with people spilling out onto the lawn. The outpouring of support was a testament to Rose's kindness and her place in the heart of Oakhaven. Peter and Mary, dressed in their Sunday best, sat beside their parents, their faces pale and drawn. They were surrounded by a sea of grieving faces, but they felt utterly alone, isolated by their shared guilt and unspoken knowledge of what had led to Rose's death. Maggie, her eyes red-rimmed from crying, struggled to maintain her composure. She had lost not only her sister but also her best friend, her confidant, the person who had always been there for her. The grief was overwhelming, a physical ache that consumed her. John, Rose's husband, was inconsolable. He sat in stunned silence, his face etched with grief, his eyes fixed on his wife's casket. He couldn't comprehend the suddenness of her death, the senselessness of it all. Peter and Mary, burdened by the weight of their secret, were consumed by guilt. They knew that their actions, however innocent they had intended them to be, had played a role in Rose's death. They blamed themselves, and they were terrified of what the future held. The initial period of grief is described with sensitivity and detail, highlighting the emotional toll on all the characters. The shared guilt of Peter and Mary is a central theme, setting the stage for their long journey towards healing and forgiveness. In the aftermath of the tragedy, both families recognized the need for professional help. They were overwhelmed by grief, and they knew that Peter and Mary needed specialized counseling to cope with the trauma they had experienced. Maggie, despite her own grief, took the initiative. She contacted a child psychologist, Dr. Susan Miller, who had experience working with children who had experienced trauma and loss. She also reached out to their pastor, Reverend Johnson, seeking spiritual guidance and support. The Petersons, initially resistant to the idea of therapy, eventually agreed to participate. John, in particular, struggled with the concept of seeking help, believing that he should be able to handle his grief on his own. But he recognized that his daughter needed support, and he was willing to do whatever it took to help her. Reverend Johnson, a kind and compassionate man, became a source of comfort and guidance for both families. He visited them regularly, offering prayers, listening to their concerns, and reminding them of the importance of faith and forgiveness. The church community also rallied around the families, providing meals, offering childcare, and simply being there to listen and offer support. The outpouring of love and compassion helped to ease the burden of grief, reminding them that they were not alone. Dr. Miller began seeing Peter and Mary separately, creating a safe and supportive environment for them to express their feelings. She used play therapy, art therapy, and other techniques to help them process their trauma, understand their guilt, and begin the long journey towards healing. The seeking of help, both professional and spiritual, is a crucial step in the recovery process. The introduction of Dr. Miller and Reverend Johnson provides sources of expertise and support, guiding the families through their grief and helping the children cope with their trauma. Peter and Mary's therapy sessions with Dr. Miller were initially difficult. They were reluctant to talk, their guilt and shame overwhelming. They were afraid of being judged, of being punished, of being seen as bad children. Dr. Miller, with patience and empathy, gradually gained their trust. She assured them that they were not bad, that they were children who had made a mistake with tragic consequences. She emphasized that they were not responsible for Rose's death, that her underlying heart condition was the primary cause. She helped them understand that their curiosity, while natural, had led them down a dangerous path. She explained the importance of boundaries, of respecting their own bodies and the bodies of others. She taught them about healthy relationships, about consent, and about the dangers of inappropriate online content. The therapy sessions were also an opportunity for Peter and Mary to express their grief, to mourn the loss of Aunt Rose, and to begin to process the trauma they had experienced. They cried, they raged, they questioned, and they slowly began to heal. Dr. Miller also worked with Maggie and John, helping them understand their children's behavior, their guilt, and their need for support. She encouraged them to communicate openly with their children, to create a safe space for them to express their feelings, and to avoid placing blame. The counseling process was long and challenging, but it was also essential. It provided Peter and Mary with the tools they needed to cope with their trauma, to understand their mistakes, and to move forward with their lives. It also helped the families to heal, to rebuild their relationships, and to find a way to live with their grief. The focus on counseling and understanding highlights the importance of professional help in dealing with trauma and loss. It emphasizes the need for patience, empathy, and open communication in the healing process. The tragedy forced Maggie and John to confront their own shortcomings as parents. They had been loving and supportive, but they had also been naive, trusting, and perhaps a little too complacent. Maggie, in particular, blamed herself. She had given Peter the phone, despite her initial reservations. She had trusted the parental controls, assuming they would protect him from harm. She had failed to recognize the warning signs, the subtle changes in Peter's behavior that should have alerted her to the problem. She spent countless nights replaying the events leading up to Rose's death, wondering what she could have done differently, what signs she had missed. The guilt was a heavy burden, a constant reminder of her perceived failure. John, too, was consumed by guilt. He had been less involved in Mary's day-to-day life, leaving most of the parenting responsibilities to Rose. He now regretted that he hadn't been more present, more attentive, more aware of the potential dangers lurking in the digital world. They both realized that they had been too trusting, too complacent about the risks of technology. They had assumed that their children were safe in their small town, in their seemingly idyllic world. They had failed to recognize the insidious ways that inappropriate content could infiltrate their lives, even with parental controls in place. Through counseling and reflection, they began to understand that they were not solely to blame. They were parents navigating a complex and ever-changing digital landscape, a landscape that presented challenges that previous generations had never faced. They resolved to be more vigilant, more involved, and more proactive in protecting their children from harm. They educated themselves about internet safety, learned about the latest apps and websites, and engaged in open and honest conversations with Peter and Mary about the dangers of the online world. The parental reflection is a crucial part of the story, highlighting the challenges of parenting in the digital age and the importance of ongoing vigilance and open communication. It also emphasizes that parents are not perfect, that they make mistakes, and that they can learn and grow from those mistakes. The community of Oakhaven, initially shocked and bewildered by the tragedy, rallied around the grieving families. The outpouring of support was a testament to the close-knit nature of the small town, where neighbors looked out for each other and where shared grief brought people together. The church, led by Reverend Johnson, played a central role in providing comfort and support. They organized prayer vigils, offered counseling services, and provided meals for the families. They also created a safe space for community members to share their grief, to offer condolences, and to begin the process of healing. Neighbors and friends reached out, offering practical help and emotional support. They brought casseroles, mowed lawns, ran errands, and simply listened, offering a shoulder to cry on and a reminder that the families were not alone. The school, too, provided support. The teachers and counselors worked with Peter and Mary, helping them adjust to their return to school and providing a supportive environment. They also implemented new programs on internet safety, educating students and parents about the potential dangers of online content. The community's response was a powerful reminder of the importance of human connection in times of tragedy. It demonstrated the resilience of the human spirit and the ability of people to come together to support one another in times of need. The community support aspect of the story highlights the positive role that a strong community can play in helping families cope with loss and trauma. It provides a counterpoint to the isolation and judgment that can sometimes accompany such tragedies. Part 15: Forgiveness, or the struggle for it. Forgiveness was perhaps the most challenging aspect of the healing process. Could Maggie forgive Peter for his role in Rose's death? Could Peter and Mary forgive themselves? Could John forgive Maggie and Peter? Could the two families ever truly reconcile? These were questions that had no easy answers. The grief was still raw, the wounds still fresh, the anger, the guilt, and the pain were still palpable. Maggie, despite her overwhelming grief, never blamed Peter directly. She understood that he was a child, that he had made a mistake with devastating consequences. But she also struggled with the knowledge that his actions had contributed to her sister's death. She wrestled to forgive him. Peter, consumed by guilt, struggled to forgive himself. He carried the weight of Rose's death on his small shoulders, believing that he was responsible for her passing. He had nightmares, he withdrew from his friends, and he struggled to concentrate in school. Mary, too, was burdened by guilt. She blamed herself for not stopping Peter, for not speaking up, for not preventing the tragedy. John, initially consumed by anger and grief, struggled to forgive Maggie and Peter. He saw Peter as the instigator, the one who had led Mary astray. He blamed Maggie for giving Peter the phone, for not monitoring his activities more closely. The families, once so close, were now fractured by grief and blame. The road to forgiveness was long and arduous, filled with setbacks and emotional turmoil. Through counseling, through prayer, and through countless conversations, they slowly began to make progress. They learned to communicate their feelings, to express their anger and their grief, and to listen to each other with empathy and understanding. Maggie eventually came to a place of forgiveness for Peter. She realized that he was a child, that he had made a mistake, and that he was suffering immensely. She saw the remorse in his eyes, the pain in his heart, and she knew that she had to forgive him, not only for his sake but for her own. Peter and Mary, through therapy and unwavering support of their families, gradually began to forgive themselves. They learned to accept that they were not solely responsible for Rose's death, that it was a tragic accident, a confluence of unfortunate circumstances. John's journey towards forgiveness was the most difficult. He held onto his anger for a long time, unable to let go of the pain and the blame. But eventually, through the persistent efforts of his pastor and his own deep-seated faith, he began to soften. He realized that holding onto anger would only prolong the suffering, that forgiveness was the only path to healing. The forgiveness aspect of the story highlights the complex and challenging process of healing after a tragedy. It emphasizes that forgiveness is not a single event, but rather a journey, a process that requires time, effort, and a willingness to let go of anger and blame. The tragedy of Rose's death served as a harsh but powerful lesson for everyone involved. It was a wake-up call, a stark reminder of the dangers of the digital world and the importance of parental guidance and open communication. Maggie and John, forever changed by the experience, became advocates for internet safety. They shared their story with other parents, warning them about the potential dangers of unsupervised internet access and the importance of monitoring their children's online activities. They worked with the school to implement stricter policies regarding phone usage and to provide more comprehensive education on internet safety. They also became active in their church, supporting other families who were struggling with similar issues. Peter and Mary, forever scarred by their experience, learned a profound lesson about the consequences of their actions. They learned the importance of making responsible choices, of respecting boundaries, and of seeking help when they needed it. They also learned the power of forgiveness, both of themselves and of others. They learned that healing is possible, even after the most devastating of losses. The community of Oakhaven, too, learned a valuable lesson. They learned the importance of coming together in times of tragedy, of offering support and compassion, and of working together to create a safer environment for their children. The story emphasizes the lasting impact of the tragedy, but also the positive changes that emerged from it. It highlights the importance of learning from mistakes, of advocating for change, and of finding strength in community. Years passed. Peter and Mary, no longer the innocent children they once were, grew into responsible teenagers. The scars of the past remained, but they had learned to live with them, to integrate them into their lives, and to move forward. Peter, guided by his mother and his therapist, channeled his guilt and remorse into positive action. He excelled in school, became involved in community service, and developed a passion for computer science. He vowed to use his skills to create safer online environments for children, to prevent others from experiencing the pain and trauma he had endured. Mary, supported by her father and her therapist, found solace in art. She expressed her emotions through painting and drawing, creating powerful images that reflected her journey of healing and forgiveness. She dreamed of becoming an art therapist, helping other children cope with trauma and loss. The two families, though forever changed by the tragedy, gradually rebuilt their relationship. The initial anger and blame faded, replaced by a shared understanding of the pain they had all endured. They found strength in their shared grief, and they learned to support each other in new ways. The future shows the long-term impact of the tragedy, but also the positive growth and development of the children. It highlights their resilience, their determination to overcome adversity, and their commitment to making a positive difference in the world. The story of Peter and Mary is a cautionary tale, a stark reminder of the dangers that lurk in the digital world and the importance of parental guidance and open communication. It is a story of innocence lost, of tragic consequences, and of the long and difficult road to healing and forgiveness. But it is also a story of hope. It is a story of resilience, of the power of community support, and of the enduring strength of the human spirit. It is a story that emphasizes the importance of learning from mistakes, of advocating for change, and of finding meaning and purpose even in the face of unimaginable loss. It is a story that reminds us that childhood is precious and fragile, that it must be protected and nurtured. It is a story that calls for greater awareness of the dangers of the digital world and for a collective commitment to creating a safer environment for our children. And ultimately, it is a story that underscores the enduring power of love, forgiveness, and unwavering hope for a brighter future. The moral lessons are made explicit, reinforcing the key themes of the story and providing a clear takeaway message for the reader. The conclusion offers a sense of closure, while also acknowledging the lasting impact of the tragedy and the ongoing journey of healing.